And so that's how I like to contribute to reclaiming some of our foods or integrating them back into the fold and being like, this is actually a traditional food. The other one I was thinking of too was
Mhm.
peanuts, actually. Peanuts is indigenous to South America,
Right.
but for whatever reason, we don't really talk about that as well. Maybe it's just not as sexy as chia seeds. I don't know.
Doesn't sound as
So,
exotic.
we need to add some sex appeal to some peanuts.
Hey everyone, welcome to Food Culture Curious, the podcast where we dive into the intersection of culture and nutrition. I'm your host, Arely Gutierrez, a Latina registered dietitian, and I'm here to explore how cultural inclusivity can transform our approach to food, health, and well-being. Each episode aims to empower you to better understand and serve diverse communities with practical insights, personal stories, and expert advice. If you find this podcast valuable, don't forget to hit that follow button, leave us a review, and share it on your socials. You can find us as at Food Culture Curious. Hey everyone, I'm Arely Gutierrez. I'm a registered dietitian on a mission to promote cultural inclusion inside nutrition. Today we have with us Denee Bex. She's a registered dietitian and CDCES from the Navajo Nation and is the owner of Tumbleweed Nutrition LLC, a nutrition education consultant company. She teaches her native community about nutrition without judgment. Denee provides inclusive and evidence-based nutrition education for organizations which honor American Indian heritage. Thank you for being here.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you so much for being with us today. I really hope that you can help whoever's listening understand just a little bit more about your traditional foods and the population that you're currently trying to help. I really love following you on Instagram because you're always giving little nuggets of information. So I hope if they don't follow you, then after this episode, they will. But let's go ahead and jump right into it. Tell me a little bit about the foods that you grew up with.
Yeah, so hi everybody. My name is Denee. So I am a registered dietitian and I am also Navajo or Denee. And I grew up on the Navajo reservation, which if you aren't familiar with it, it is located mostly in Arizona, but it's what we call the Four Corners region. It covers three states of the Four Corners region, and that's Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. Most of the Navajo Nation is in Arizona, and there's little parts going into Utah and in New Mexico, and that's where I'm at right now. I currently live in Farmington, New Mexico, but growing up on the Arizona side, I call it the Arizona side, I grew up in Chinle, Arizona. So some of you may be familiar with it because it is the town that directly surrounds a national park, a national monument, which is Canyon de Chelly. And so you might have visited it. If you did, I'm pretty sure you passed my house or where my house used to be when you visited the national park because my house was like right next to the canyon. So I grew up with traditional foods, traditional Navajo foods, but I don't think I really registered them as traditional Navajo because the town that I grew up in, it's 95% Navajo, so it was just food. It wasn't anything separate. When we're talking about traditional foods like blue corn mush, mutton, different melons, and lots of beans, and then some of those more cultural foods, some of those like more recent foods that were a result of colonization, things like fry bread and spam. Like I consider those Navajo cultural foods because they're a really intense part of our culture. And so I grew up with those kind of foods and yeah, my mom would usually make fry bread on the weekends. We'd go to my grandma's house on the weekends and just have Navajo tacos, which is if you've never had one, it's really good. It's amazing. It's basically fry bread with a bunch of beans on top and cheese and lettuce and tomatoes. So a lot of indigenous communities' foods have been heavily influenced by outside influences like Spanish influences, Latin America, European, obviously. It's a mishmash of all these different things. Yeah, that's what I grew up with.
Let's try to break it up a little bit by food group. Expand a little bit more on what are the major sources of protein? What are some staples of protein? I know you mentioned beans, you mentioned spam. Are there any other very common sources of protein?
Yeah. So for protein, Navajos love sheep. We love mutton and lamb. And yeah, that was somewhat a Spanish introduction. We did have like indigenous mountain goats before colonization happened. So there are stories about that, but really it wasn't until the Spanish introduction of sheep that we really just made it our life. We made it our identity. And so we're very big mutton eaters. And then, of course, beef and pork and chicken and spam is something, another cultural food that's pretty heavily used. And I was just talking about this the other day about how spam was introduced to our communities because it's such a random thing. It's not very commonly eaten like in other places or in cities. People make fun of it. But for us Navajos, we like it in our burritos, we like it in the morning. But that history comes from when we had soldiers called the Code Talkers who were pretty important during World War II. They came back home and decided to bring the spam product back with them because they were given spam out in the field when they were at war. And they were like, hey, that's a pretty shelf stable source of protein. And
Mhm.
many in our community at the time and still today have less access to electricity and running water and indoor plumbing. And so it's just easier to keep on hand instead of like fresh meats and stuff. Yeah, those are the top protein sources, beef as well. I always joke around that pork chop is like our indigenous food now. Mainly because it's a cheap source of protein and many in our community have lower incomes, and so a lot of our food and eating decisions is driven by budget and what we have access to that's within our budget. Many in our community have used SNAP and food stamps and WIC. And so those are just things we have to keep in mind as dietitians is we're not going out and buying blueberries and kale and all this fancy stuff. We're just trying to see what's gonna keep the longest at our house. So that's protein. Vegetables, Navajo, I would say native too, native vegetables. Obviously, people think of like corn, beans, and squash as being like the poster child for native vegetables, but we also have a lot more. Some vegetables we've lost our connection with, and some of my work is also about talking about these vegetables that we used to eat in the past, but now we don't. Same goes for fruit.
What are some examples of those forgotten fruits and vegetables that you're trying to bring awareness to?
So this is the thing with colonization and forced relocation and boarding schools. Many of our younger generations, and when I say like younger, millennial and below, which I'm a millennial and younger, we've lost that connection to many traditional foods and those food
Mhm.
ways. And some of us are trying to find out ways or find out like what we used to eat in the past. I was talking with a few of my colleagues about this and some of my patients too, and they said we used to eat zucchini flowers. That used to be incorporated into stews. That's something that Italians do, and they still do, but for us, we just stopped doing that, which that would be considered a vegetable, a non-starchy vegetable. Chuth chin, which is a sumac berry. It grows heavily on the western United States. Different greens that we would consider quote unquote weeds, but they were actually eaten in the past. There's something called Navajo spinach, and it grows really tall and it has a purple flower. And apparently the leaves used to be used to incorporate into dishes too. And so because of our history and because of globalization,
Mhm.
sometimes it's a little daunting to keep in touch with it or reconnect with it. And so that's what some of my work is about as well as, hey, we had all these really nutritious foods, and how do we reconnect with it in a different way? So as far as like Navajo fruits and veggies, that's what we got going on. But our big thing is corn. We definitely love our corn. And blue corn specifically for many Southwest tribes is like our thing. now it's really cool to be seeing blue corn being incorporated to a lot of different foods and not just eaten in the traditional way, which the traditional way we call it toshchin, and it's like a porridge, like grits. And that's what grits are, or that's how grits came to be because the blue corn mush is like the ancestor of grits. And so we definitely love corn, and blue corn is being added to a lot of things like cakes and cookies and all this other stuff, and it's really delicious. So that's our thing with, at least specifically as Navajo goes. Like I said, I'm Navajo, and usually my goal is to work with other tribal organizations as well. But I do know that I have limitations when I go to different communities because there's 574 federally recognized tribes.
Yeah.
That means there's all these different eating patterns and access to indigenous foods. And sometimes I can only speak from a perspective of my Southwest tribal Navajo perspective when it comes to Northwest Siletz tribes or Chumash tribes or North northeast or southeast or plains. I'm like, I don't know what you guys eat. But
Exactly.
also I have to recognize that's my limitation. And so when I go out to communities and talk about traditional foods, that's some of the homework that I have to do. I have to find out like, okay, what are your commonly eaten foods? Not just like those traditional indigenous foods, but those cultural foods too. It could be ramen noodles. That's your thing. And how do you prepare ramen noodles? That's a little bit more connected to your community. That's what I do. As far
And
as other food groups, we got protein, veggies, fruits, grains. Grains, definitely corn. We use it more as a grain and not a vegetable. We use it in more starchy products, baked goods, and then dairy alternatives. 80% of our native indigenous communities are lactose intolerant.
mm,
And so that means that we can't just go out and say, go drink more milk for calcium and protein because it's no way. Nobody wants to be around that person if they're drinking milk. I don't want to be near my family with certain family members if they drink milk. So we have to be aware that's a reality. And then also understanding what were those indigenous forms of calcium and protein, and understanding how do we integrate our recommendations based on those indigenous foods. So, for example, my tribe, Navajo tribe, we got our calcium obviously from water and stuff, but
mm,
also juniper ash, which is what we add to our blue corn mush. And that helps like the nixtamalization process, but it
mm,
also has calcium in there as well. That so that gives us a little bit of calcium too. And then also for some other tribes, if they're eating bones with their fish, that's a source of calcium. If they're eating dark leafy greens, that's a source of calcium. So that's where it takes the homework. Like we got to do our homework to see what were some of those indigenous foods that provided us with these different nutrients. So that's what I tell my community, my patients when they ask me about dairy or dairy alternatives. And usually the question is milk bad for you? Or is almond milk bad for you? And I'm like, it's not an issue of being bad. It's just sometimes our bodies just don't agree with it, and it depends
mhm,
on your goals. And it depends on if you want to incorporate more indigenous foods into your diet, then we can look at, okay, what are these sources of nutrients that were indigenous to us? And a lot of that is just rediscovering some of those foods too. And yeah,
mm.
so that's a little bit more about our different food eating habits.
And like you said, our ancestors survived for generations upon generations, so they were obviously getting their nutrients from somewhere.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's really cool that you help them rediscover their history and the way we used to nourish ourselves and can still nourish ourselves now. And another thing that I love that you talked about was being aware of your own limitations, because I can have 100 different Mexican patients. They might be from different regions of Mexico. There's so many things that impact someone's food preferences
Right.
that we can never assume. that we know anything about anything.
Right? The more you learn, the more you find out, the less you know.
Yeah, exactly.
After
There's
I got my master's, that's how I felt. I was just like,
Mhm.
man, I did all of this studying because I wanted to learn more about behavior change theories, and now I feel like I know less.
Yeah.
And that's how I feel with Indigenous foods as well. Like as much as I feel like, I don't know, maybe the perception is that I know a lot about native foods, but I can think of so many other people in the area that know more about Navajo foods. And I'm just like doing my best to learn as well.
Mhm.
And being patient with myself and giving myself grace for not knowing how do you make underground cake step by step.
Yeah.
And
Oh.
so yeah, that's yeah, just understanding that I wouldn't call them limitations. I would call them opportunities to learn.
That too.
And that's what being a human is about, right? We're just
Hmm.
constantly learning.
Yeah, absolutely. I still find that I'm learning so much. I'm on this journey to learn more about other cultural foods, but I'm also learning about my own. And there's still so many things that I had no idea. I had a friend who told me, "Oh, I make a vegan horchata." And I'm like, "Vegan horchata? I thought horchata was rice milk." And most people add milk to horchata. I'm like, I didn't know that. I just thought
Yeah.
I knew it was rice milk and I thought it was just rice milk. I didn't know they added dairy to it. So
Yeah.
it's something like that. Like I grew up thinking a food is made a certain way, but because I've never made it personally, I've only drank it.
Yeah.
I learned something that day.
Yeah.
And my friend and I made mole from scratch. And same thing, like I had only ever eaten mole, I had never made it. And I was like, oh my God, it has 1,000 different ingredients.
Yeah. I bet. I bet. Oh, it must have been really good.
It was so.
Yeah, and so we're just all learning, right? And for me, I feel like part of my learning journey too is sharing that knowledge on more of
Hmm.
a bigger platform, which is probably how you found me was
Yeah.
through my Instagram or my work, because we don't really talk about nutrition issues in Native communities.
Hmm.
And to be fair, there's not many Indigenous dietitians or Native dietitians out there to talk about it.
Yeah.
And one of my goals is just for us to talk about it a little bit more and be like, this is how it is to be a dietitian on the res. We call it the reservation, which is our federally recognized land base for different tribes. Yeah, that's a little bit about that food history.
And can you share with us, just in general, what are some major holidays that you celebrated in your family or still continue to celebrate? Were there any indigenous foods that you saw during that time, or was it a combination of like more modern food and traditional food? What did your holidays look like?
It's definitely a combination. Many of people in our communities, sometimes we're integrated pretty deeply in Western foods and stuff, just regular holiday foods, turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes. We do also include some of those traditional foods like blue corn mush, maybe chief chin. We do tamales. Those are kind of foods, stews like mutton stew, ishtiji stew, dumpling stew. We incorporate a lot of those into our holidays, and we celebrate holidays like everyone else. And contrary to popular belief on social media, many of us natives do still gather on Thanksgiving. We still have the turkey on Thanksgiving and whatever, and maybe we have a different intention behind gathering. We
Mhm.
still gather. Just like all of those holidays, it may be a little bit different for each community. Like, for instance, I know there's other Native communities have different separate holidays. Like with Pueblo communities, they have something they call feasts that happen around certain celestial or certain natural occurrences during the year or certain
Mhm.
times of the year where they have feasts. We have ceremonies, and with ceremonies, we rely mostly, it's usually fry bread and stew or tortillas and stew. And that's what we eat after ceremonies because usually, depending on the ceremony, sometimes it goes all night, sometimes it's for 4 days, sometimes it happens during the day. Depends on how big it is and what the intention or purpose is, but it's usually paired with food. And so a lot of it is stews and fry bread. if we can categorize any traditional food as being traditional, definitely stews, just like cube chunks of meat with some kind of vegetable thrown in there and then
Mm.
boiled just like that. The more common type of traditional foods that we have during special celebrations.
When you say ceremonies, do you mean like wedding, or what do you mean by ceremonies?
It could be a wedding ceremony, as in like traditional native ceremonies. So it does involve, like, we call them medicine men. Sometimes they're called shamans, not in native communities, but by outsiders, that's what they call them. But for Navajos, we call them medicine men or medicine women. And they do a variety of ceremonies, different spiritual things that happen in our traditional housing in a hogan. For us Navajos, it's usually a ceremony is conducted in a hogan. A lot of meaning behind why it's held there. And so that's where, depending on the reason for the visit, it's a different consultation with a medicine man. It could be like if you're trying to figure out something out, or if you're trying to heal from certain traumas, if you're
Mm.
trying to heal from a sickness, if you're trying to come to peace with something, then you can have a ceremony for that. So it's very, usually most ceremonies end with us preparing food, or the family preparing, the family of what we call the patient, the family of the patient preparing food and offering it to the medicine man or the people who helped with the ceremony. And that's how we usually close out some of those longer ceremonies, like a kinalda, which is a puberty ceremony for girls who transitioned into womanhood. Fernda, which is a healing ceremony that takes a while. A yebache, which that one is the longer ones, which can take like up to a week. And so it's very food heavy. And so yeah, that's what a ceremony is. It's like you're going to the doctor, but the doctor's the medicine man, and that's how they're treated. And in our hospital system, like the Indian Health Service, we have started to integrate more medicine men into the hospital system. And actually, the state of Arizona actually just passed a bill that allows Medicare to bill for these spiritual services that happen in the hospital. So that's pretty cool. I thought that was
Oh,
pretty cool. And so definitely we're not preparing food for the medicine men in the hospital. I'm sure they would be happy with that, but we're not there yet. But the ones that happen in the home or
okay.
in your home area, that's what we do. And food is very much heavily tied to those events.
And tell me, are there certain foods that maybe either the medicine men use or just that you use in general? Are there certain foods that have any health beliefs tied to it? This particular food is good for if you're postpartum. This particular food is good for if you're feeling sick. Like there's just some foods that you
Something
commonly
hot, right?
see, when someone's feeling under the weather or they're in a particular stage of their life that's supposed to be health promoting. Are there any foods that have those cultural health beliefs behind it?
Definitely there are. And
Mm.
some of that is sacred knowledge that you would only
Mm.
consult with a medicine woman for or medicine man for.
Okay.
As far as other types of cultural beliefs around food, definitely for sure we have those that surround different foods. So for example, corn. And for us Navajos, the traditional perspective is that so
Mhm.
there's different genders and each gender has a different color corn. And so that ties back to creation stories. And so a
Mhm.
lot of these foods that we eat now have some role in the creation of Deneb people, because Deneb people traditionally moved from the first world to the fourth world, which is the glittering world, which is right now. And during each world, each progression of the world, different foods were present, different plants and animals were present. Different plants and animals had different roles in how it helped us progress to the next world. So, for instance, like turkey, the reason why, so this one's a little bit more common knowledge, so I feel more comfortable talking about this. But when all of the animals were trying to flee from the third world to the fourth world, Turkey understood the importance of seeds. And so he gathered all the seeds and put it in his feathers when everybody, the people, plants, animals, were trying to flee from floods in the third world, going into the fourth world. And so he gathered everything up in his feathers and before they went into the next world because of the flood.
Mm.
And that's the story behind that is that's why his tails are white, is because the water had touched the tip of his tails before he got to the fourth world. Things like that, you just
Yeah.
don't know if you didn't grow up in the community and understanding how food is really connected to our traditions and sometimes to our spirituality. And why I would see often people who were unfamiliar with native foods disparage certain native foods. And I'm like, that's not nice and that's not culturally appropriate. And that's preventing our patients from seeking health care when we have ignorant healthcare professionals just spewing off whatever they think about nutrition or food
Yeah.
or what they think is best for us. So, like, I've definitely heard of healthcare practitioners telling our elders to stop eating corn. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's like the worst thing you can say to anybody.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of these foods are connected to some of those traditional stories, I would just want to call them.
Yeah. I would love to hear a little more about what you just mentioned as far as the myths and misconceptions surrounding traditional foods that you're working to help people understand.
So when it comes to people not understanding our foods, non-native people not understanding the connection that we have to our food, I feel like it can be pretty harmful in the way we talk about food. And for native people, plants, animals, food for some native people that's they're considered as just other people that sometimes they are considered as relatives.
Yeah.
So turkey, we would consider turkey a brother. And when people say, oh, that's not good for you, or people who aren't familiar with our foods perpetuate these myths, it's not really helping to empower our people or to build the confidence of our communities to make healthier choices. So that's my own small way of combating, like, hey, these foods are nourishing. Like, our version of corn is like higher in protein, higher in fiber. I don't understand why you're talking about why we should be limiting corn when those are the things that influencers like to talk about, protein and non-GMO or whatever. It's just that the thing with native foods is we don't have the special marketing. Some indigenous foods have reached that quote unquote superfood status
Yeah.
where I saw somebody talking about superfoods are cultural foods with marketing. That's what I heard.
Yes.
That's what I remember hearing. I'm like, that is true. If you think about some of these quote unquote
Mhm.
superfoods out there, those are indigenous foods. It's just that, non-native people got a hold on it and started spinning it whatever way they wanted. Things like chia. Chia is an
Mhm.
indigenous food. It grows in California and it was harvested and foraged by many California tribes, in addition to like tribes in South America and Central America. Blueberries are indigenous, strawberries are indigenous as well. So it's just like all these foods have this health halo on it, but it's like those are just cultural foods with marketing,
Yeah.
fancy marketing.
And it's
Um,
it's like you can't win because either they're not known and therefore they're looked down upon,
yeah.
or like you said, they have this health halo and now they're not affordable to the people that were used to eating.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's pretty messed up. It's we've pumped it up so much that the foods that historically gathered them don't have that access to them anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's where my work is. It's these foods are healthy. Look, this has this kind of nutrient, that has that nutrient. This was healthy for us. And how do we reconnect with it? How do we use it and reclaim some of those foods that were taken from us? Honestly, I'm getting a little bit worried about blue corn because blue corn has the same antioxidants as blueberries, anthocyanins, and more of us natives are talking about integrating blue corn into our meals and we're making it more popular to do that. And I'm just like, one day there's going to be some white influencer on Instagram talking about how healthy, how much of a superfood blue corn is. And I'm
Mhm.
just waiting for that to drop because I'm just like, I'm scared that again it's going to be taken away from us. So
Yeah.
now we got to maintain or reclaim some of these foods that are indigenous but aren't normally regarded as indigenous now. Even like
Mhm.
tomatoes and potatoes and pumpkin,
Yeah.
those are indigenous foods.
Yeah.
Indigenous to like North and South America. I'm not
Yes.
just talking about North America.
Right now that you're mentioning the health halo and influencers, it just makes me think about what happened to avocados.
Yeah,
They just became this superfood and now they're so expensive.
exactly. And avocados are tasty. But yeah, it's just things like that. And so that's how I like to contribute to reclaiming some of our foods or integrating them back into the fold and being like, this is actually a traditional food. The other one I was thinking of too the other day was
Mhm.
peanuts, actually. Peanuts is like indigenous to South America,
Right.
but for whatever reason, like we don't really talk about that as well. Maybe it's just not as sexy as chia seeds. I don't know.
Doesn't sound as
So,
exotic.
we need to add some sex appeal to some peanuts. So yeah, I that's what I think a lot about. And so as a dietitian, I'm thinking like, okay, what can I do? My skill set is talking about nutrients and what it does in our bodies. And so how can I use that skill set in a way that also integrates some of these indigenous or traditional foods? And like I said, you definitely don't feel like I'm a Navajo food expert. I like Navajo food. I like to eat it. But I know there's a lot of other people in my community who really know the best time to harvest this, the best time to do this, and how do you like butcher a sheep in under an hour and all that good stuff. And I'm like, I definitely don't have that knowledge base. Like as a dietitian, I can talk about why it's important to honor these foodways and also talk about the nutritional aspect, but also like some of that mental health aspect too, and this healing from trauma aspect, and why cultural foods are important in this conversation about healing from 500 years of trauma.
Yeah. Can you talk to us a little bit about some major nutrition care challenges? I know we've mentioned a few, right? Access and difficulty with electricity, water. Can you expand a little bit about the nutrition care challenges that the Navajo population faces?
I know your audience is probably gonna think I'm gonna say diabetes. And yeah, diabetes is an issue. I feel like we're the poster children for diabetes. Like in our classes, when diabetes comes up, they always drag out the poor native communities and how they talk about this community has high rates of diabetes. And it's just, oh my gosh, just get over it. There's other conditions out there that we are dealing with as well. Obviously, we have higher rates of chronic diseases like diabetes, heart disease, certain types of cancer. But one of the things when I used to work as a clinical dietitian, I used to work in outpatient, was malnutrition as well, and specifically protein calorie malnutrition. Some of our elders would face that related to lack of utilities or condition related, so liver disease, renal failure related malnutrition. And so that was one of the things in the hospital that I used to work at is talking about we have yeah, we can talk about diabetes and diabetes prevention, but also how do we address all of these other not glucose related conditions like malnutrition? And when I worked at the hospital, I kind of developed, me and the rest of our department developed an initiative to start having our providers screen for malnutrition, and especially the ones that were admitted to the hospital, to our ICU and MSU, and have all the nurses ask those two or three screener questions from
Mhm.
Aspen, I think it was. So, other things to be mindful of in our communities, definitely kidney related. Actually, a lot of our patients, a lot of our community have gallbladder issues, and a lot of them have to have like cholecystectomies because they get gallbladder infections or gallstones. I remember the surgeon was complaining. He said, I wish somebody told me 90% of my surgeries would be for gallbladders before I came here so I could be prepared. But again, going back to sometimes our bodies aren't used to this newer food that
Mhm.
we have access to now. And there was another condition I was thinking about, either colon cancer or diverticulitis.
Okay.
And just because many of our communities, they don't, like the rest of America, don't have enough fiber in their diet, don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. And so there's issues with constipation and diverticulitis, diverticulosis as well. When I got referrals, those are like the top five conditions that I would see a lot of. But also, sometimes when I would see these patients, they would also have, I would suspect like disordered eating as well. And there is literally no data on eating disorder prevalence in Native communities. And I
Mhm.
feel like that's something that we also need to address because I understand that because of our diabetes rates, there's this huge push to prevent diabetes and manage diabetes and all this nutrition advice going out. And I feel like that's also caused this backlash effect where people are starting to fall into this disordered eating patterns in the name of diabetes prevention. But I'm
Right.
like, that's just a eating disorder. Like you're supposed to
Mm.
eat, not just drink water all day.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like a lot of those eating disorders get overlooked, especially when, oh, you're losing weight, that's good.
Yeah.
Or oh, they have a high BMI. They're not suffering from
Yep.
malnutrition or they're not suffering from an eating disorder. But
Yep. Yep. And many of my patients did have eating disorder behaviors and they would tell me over and over again, my doctor told me to lose weight, and they're working out for 4 hours a day and not eating anything. And
yeah.
I'm just like, that's not healthy. You're supposed to fuel yourself properly when you work out. It's your
Mhm.
business if you want to work out for 4 hours, but understand there's a balance that has to go on to make sure that you're properly fueled. So, yeah, those are the common health condition issues that I would typically see, like in the hospital.
Yeah. And how do you, if you have any advice for us, how do you work to help them meet these health goals while still incorporating their cultural foods?
I always like to break it down to the food groups. In our community, they like to say that we're visual learners, which I feel like everybody's a visual learner, but we're very adamant about saying we're visual learners. And so food groups allow for that visual engagement. So that's what I would talk about is okay, these are the food groups, and then include traditional foods in those food groups.
Mhm.
So, for instance, blue corn, what is it? Is it a vegetable? Is it a grain? How would we categorize it? Why does it belong in this food group and not that food group? Mutton, where does that belong? Because they've been told for so long not to eat mutton, which it's just like beef.
Yeah.
Like, why is it so different? And so put that in protein. So I guide people in telling them like this is how you would categorize these foods, and then balance would be 3 to 5 food groups per meal, 1 to 2 food groups for a snack. And then that way we can make sure we're eating enough, we're having a wider variety of nutrients, and then also understanding that it's just not fresh that counts as quote unquote healthy.
Mhm.
Looking at dried foods, canned goods, frozen foods, and then how do we navigate those different products to make sure that our health goals are being met. So if somebody has high blood pressure, how do we use canned foods that say low salt or no salt? Which frozen foods are the ones that have less salt? And if somebody wants more convenience, like what canned soups would be good options for us too, because we're always on the go, just like everybody else. If we're not driving, then we're doing something else. And that's how we talk. And of course, tailoring the information to each patient and just understanding what are your personal health goals. I know, your provider may have told you what
Yeah.
your what they think your health goals should be, but what do you personally feel like you want to work on or
Mm.
is important to you? Is it just getting enough food in during the day? Is it just making sure you're drinking enough water or staying hydrated? Is it getting sleep? Is it meal planning? Is it feeding your kids balanced meals? Or is it just learning how to cook? And so everybody has different health goals. And so that's where us as dietitians can come in and talk a little bit about defining what those health goals are. And so, yeah, it really does take a tailored approach to see what people need. And then also just having that real conversation of, you do not have to eliminate your traditional foods for you to meet these health goals. And it's depressing how much I have had to say that out loud to my patients.
Yeah.
And there have been some times where my patients would literally cry because they have never heard that before.
Mhm.
And I'm like, what have we done? What have we done to make people feel like they cannot be in connection with their heritage? Yeah, that's like a snippet overview of what I like to talk about with my communities and just destigmatize some of those cultural foods or traditional or indigenous foods
Mm.
and just say, okay, this stew, like mutton stew, has like carrots, potatoes, celery, and mutton. Sometimes people think to be healthy, they have to stop eating that stew. And I'm
Mhm.
like, that's vegetables.
Yeah.
That's vegetables, that's zinc, that's iron, that's protein. Why are we trying to tell people to get rid of it? So I talk about the health benefits of stews, what vitamins and minerals are in there that we can appreciate. If we're concerned about, the collection of fat that's on top of the stew, it's like maybe you can skim it off. Usually, stew is eaten with fry bread. And man, I'm getting hungry, but it's usually eaten with fry bread. And so I'm like, okay, if you're trying to meet certain health goals, maybe if you don't want to get rid of fry bread, cutting it in half, trying to find an extra side item. So maybe adding in a fruit with that. So then you feel a
Mhm.
little bit fuller from the fiber. And so it's always like just trying to navigate this. And some people are very adamant about not eating fry bread. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. So, what are some other ways we can navigate these choices for you? Maybe if you're trying to eat more indigenous foods, like maybe you can have blue corn mush in the morning. And how do we make sure that blue corn mush is well balanced? Because usually people just eat the corn by itself, that dish by itself. So I like to talk about, hey, how can we add in protein? How can we add in maybe some fruits? Or how can we just make it a little bit more balanced to make sure you're feeling satisfied from that meal? So, yeah, that's how I would approach that or do approach it.
Those are some amazing takeaways. If anyone's listening to this, that they can actually see how you would approach working with that population. And I just really love how, and this is what we all should be doing, honestly, instead of cutting out foods is just learning like what is that food, teaching the patient where that falls into as far as the food groups or if they're using my plate or whatever they're using and how that balances out. And like you mentioned, sometimes it's portion control, like with the fried bread instead of all of it, maybe half of it, adding in more nutrition in other parts. So all of that, wonderful. I love it.
Yeah, and I don't think people have heard that before. At least many in my community haven't heard that
Yeah.
because there's not many native dietitians out
Hmm.
there to talk about these modifications to our eating. For the most part, when our community think of a dietitian, they're usually thinking of a skinny white lady who's coming here to take away their food. And I'm like, no, we don't. We have healthy food. And if anything, we should be leaning into more of these foods and not trying to replace hummus or I don't know what else, like whatever health halo food is out there, hummus. And I love hummus. just FYI, but many in my community don't know what that is. And so that is not something I'm going to recommend to my
Right.
community. If
Yeah,
they have a
because
question about it, I'll talk about it, but I'm not going to force them to start eating that when we have all these other really amazing, nutritious foods.
exactly. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. I really appreciate you being on. And if there's anyone that wants to work with you, how can they find you?
So I don't do individualized counseling,
Okay.
but if you want to check out my website, you can go to tumbleweednutrition.com. Or if you want to follow me on Instagram, I am at tumbleweed_nutrition to follow along in what I do.
Awesome. Thank you again, and don't be a stranger.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone. Until next time. If you are interested in supporting this podcast, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/foodculturecurious. Or as always, you can support by sharing, following, or rating this podcast. Every click from y'all means the world to me. And now for a quick disclaimer. Food Culture Curious is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not take the place of medical advice from licensed healthcare professionals. If you need to seek medical advice, please speak to your healthcare provider. Thank you for listening.